So in this segment, I want to discuss Rory Stewart saying the Tory party's decline really happened with Boris Johnson when I think he's wrong. I think it started with austerity, to be honest with you.
I think what we're looking at is the collapse of the Conservative Party, but it's a slower collapse. I mean, I think the beginning of the collapse began with the election of Boris Johnson.
I think the beginning of the collapse happened with David Cameron when he went for Brexit, to be honest. I think that's what really broke the Conservative Party because, you know, even though they had a lot of Eurosceptics, they were still roughly together. It's when David Cameron won that majority in 2015 and had to go through the Brexit referendum and resigned. That's when I think the Conservative collapse began.
Because he was not a serious figure, and so he undermined. I mean, the Conservative Party's got a lot of problems. Obviously, you know, I was a Conservative MP, and I should be frank about them. But traditionally, the way in which Conservative Party campaigned against Labour is by suggesting that they were more sort of serious. Labour more compassionate, more loving, but the Conservatives were going to look after your money. They were going to be more like a sort of reliable bank manager. And of course, from 2019 onwards, they've blown that completely. They brought in Boris Johnson, who was manifestly unfit to be Prime Minister, a kind of comical, dishonest buffoon. And
so that point about the Conservatives being better with people's money, you know, that point is simply untrue. The Conservatives are worse with people's money. We've seen that with the amount of disposable income people have and things like that. Like, things have been bad since 2010. They've only gotten way worse since kind of the Boris Johnson election, but things like disposable income haven't really been going up. Child poverty been going up under the Conservatives. There's no real economic metric to say things have gotten better for the average person under the Conservatives since 2010. So I think him blaming it on kind of Boris Johnson, I think is simply untrue. I would blame austerity and Brexit, to be honest with you.
Then they really lost it with Liz Truss, because that was the point at which people felt, well, we can't even trust them with our money. I mean, look at this as reckless, it's lacking prudence. And Rishi Sunak is part of this story. It's a part of a story, the way in which the Conservative Party lost its way. It lost its values, I think, because this is part about losing its values in the way that it thought about its leaders, but also ultimately the way in which it thought about being a serious government.
When, you know, were the Conservatives that serious under David Cameron? Like, this idea of conservative values, it very much reminds you of British values. Like, what are conservative values? Because the tradition of small c conservatism, I've not really seen that from these conservative governments. I've seen them kind of just destroy things. We saw that with Brexit. We saw that with austerity. We saw that with them polluting the waterways and things like that. What is actual conservative? What are conservative values? And I'm talking big C conservatism as in the Conservative Party and small c conservatism as in the ideology. No, at what point do the party separate from those ideals? Because they've never really been one and the same. Him talking about managing people's money and things like that, that is true to an extent. But again, like, they always gave the veneer that they were better at managing people's money, but they weren't really. I mean, we had an economic crash under John Major, when I think that was very much avoidable. The '08 crash, Labour didn't put us in the strongest position, especially with some of the policies that they took out, but that was a global crash. The one in the mid-90s, I don't think was a global crash. So the idea that the Conservatives are better with people's money is untrue.
We really lost it with Liz Truss, because that was plus it's lacking prudence. And Rishi Sunak is part of this, I think, because this is part about losing its values in the way that it thought about its leaders, but also ultimately the way in which it thought about being a serious government.
You write a lot about that in your book, Politics on the Edge.
Book plug, let's go, Sue.
I wonder whether that losing its way is down to the fact that it just got obsessed with some ideological issues, that it became obsessed with ideology, which is a very, you could argue, un-Tory thing to do, or whether it's the actual process of government, how Number 10...
It's because their policies broke the country. That's why. David Cameron was a deeply unpopular person who won that 2015 election. People didn't like him, hence why they voted. Some of these people voted for Brexit because they voted to annoy the incumbent prime minister, the prime minister, because he was against Brexit. That's one of the reasons people voted for it, and so he was deeply unpopular because his policies were deeply unpopular. That's where one of the main problems come from. And so austerity really broke the country. Boris Johnson had to come in and say, "No, I'm different. There won't be austerity under me," and things like that. He had to kind of persuade him. Well, he did persuade people that the last decade was not, he was going to be different to his predecessors, even though they were part of the same party. That's what broke the country.
How Whitehall...
Rory Stewart won't admit that it was austerity because he was one of the main instigators of austerity. He was there during those governments.
will work? Or is it a bit of both?
It's that, and it's also our culture, partly our media, partly voters. What really happens is that these parties, and this is the risk facing Labour, I think it's certain now that Labour will be the next government, in my view anyway. The risk facing all of them is that we're in a culture now that puts campaigning ahead of government. What really matters is getting votes. And so why are they choosing Boris Johnson? They're choosing him because they think he can get some votes. It's not that they think he's going to be a good prime minister, that he's going to make good decisions around the country well. Why are they going for Liz Truss? Well, because that sort of ideological radicalism appealed to a kind of rump of the Conservative Party. And the common thread running through, why are they, to my horror, announcing an idea on national service, which could be a good idea, done properly, works in Norway, but why announce it in the middle of an election campaign when you guarantee that Labour's going to reject it? And why not implement it when you're in office? You got 14 years in office. Why didn't you do it then?
There's a good point about the 14 years thing. I agree with that. It just shows you that this idea of national service was a bad idea. Him talking about, it works in Norway. Norway do offer a reason for younger people to actually care about doing national service because they have way better facilities and care for young people. This country don't care about young people. Politicians don't care about young people.
And the answer is that that's a classic example. It's the way in which you're not sitting down and saying, wow, this is an amazing country facing very big problems. What are the serious, thoughtful decisions I can make over the next 20 years?
This sort of kind of annoys me about Rory Stewart is that people give him way too much credit. He was there during the austerity years, and that's what those are the things that really broke the country. Because if you look at Brexit, right, Boris Johnson, David Cameron, deeply unpopular, and the other problem was that you voting for Remain was voting for status quo, which people didn't like. People didn't like the status quo because it wasn't that great for them. At least they didn't feel it at the time, and that was partly down to austerity. You had Boris Johnson come in and say, I'm different to those other prime ministers. Why did he have to say he was different? Why do you have to talk about building 40 new hospitals and all of this stuff? Because he wanted to prove that he was going to do the things that people wanted him to do. Whether people believed him, which they shouldn't have done, but is blatant lies. Building 40 hospitals in the space of 5 years. Ridiculous, honestly. But point being is, the reason they brought in Boris Johnson is because he can win, not just because he can win votes, is because he wasn't really associated with the Cameron government. He was with the May government a little bit, but not with the brutal austerity. This is what I'm saying. And Rory Stewart kind of puts the blame on Boris Johnson, especially because it kind of takes Rory Stewart out of the firing line. Because he was effectively, I think he left the party, but they weren't going to run with him because Boris Johnson kind of purged a lot of the One Nation Tories from the party. So, his analysis here is pretty poor, to be honest with you. And I think he's done that because he's taken himself out of the firing line. And I would love it, because I don't watch the Austerity Boy and War Criminal podcast. I would love it if someone made him be more honest about the impact that austerity had on this country, because we didn't have to do it. And if anything, it's been bad for the economy. So really, it's not done the thing that it was meant to do, supposedly, which was to fix the economy. All it did was make it much worse for the average person and help do a wealth transfer to the highest earners in the country, because they cut taxes for the top earners. They cut it from 50% to 45%. So I would love to see these questions being asked to Rory Stewart, because his analysis lets him get away with things. And I don't think we should let that stand, considering he was an elected official during the Cameron and May governments. So why should his analysis let him get scot-free of the bad things he did? I know there are a lot of people who like him because he called out Brexit and whatever, but that period of history is gone. And if you want to look at people who have done great things or whatever, you can't just view everything through a Brexit lens. Politics didn't start in 2016. And that's one of the things that people fail to understand, in my opinion, that they say, oh, he's anti-Brexit, he must be good. It's like, no, Theresa May was anti-Brexit until she became Prime Minister. You see the difference. Just don't buy into these false heroes, especially the Conservative ones. There's a few Conservative MPs I rate, but not many. Probably one or two at best. But anyways, let me know what you think in the comments below. Like, comment, share, subscribe. Support the channel on Patreon if you can. And hopefully I'll see you in the next one.